You're nothing but a hillbilly with no qualifications." Ricardo Vasconcelos laughed in front of 15 executives. He had no idea he was humiliating the very CEO in disguise. What happened in the next 30 minutes destroyed his career forever. The 27th floor of Millennium Tower cut through the New York skyline like a blade of glass and steel. There, nearly 2,000 feet above ground, was the beating heart of Millennium Tech, one of the largest technology companies in the country. The main boardroom was a monument to modern corporate power, where an $80,000 mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by 15 Italian leather chairs, each worth more than a standard sedan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 180-degree view of the city, and far below, millions of people hurried like ants, oblivious to the billion-dollar decisions being made at such heights. The air conditioning kept the room at a perfect 72 degrees, while the aroma of imported Colombian coffee floated through the air, served in fine German porcelain worth more than a worker's monthly paycheck. It was Thursday, November 9th, 9 o'clock sharp, and the monthly executive board meeting was about to begin. The topic of the day carried a $50 million weight: the decision to either expand operations across Latin America or invest in artificial intelligence, a choice that would shape the company's future for the next 5 years. Around the table, 15 of the most powerful executives in the nation adjusted silk ties and checked Swiss watches. Dr. Fernando Almeida, the CFO for 12 years, flipped through reports with figures that made heads spin, while Dr. Carla Montenegro, VP of Technology, double-checked slides on her state-of-the-art laptop. Roberto Silva, the HR director, sipped coffee while reviewing spreadsheets that would determine the future of thousands of employees. Each one carried the burden of a decision that would impact not just the company, but the entire tech industry's economy. At the top of the hierarchy, the CEO's chair remained empty. Marina Santos had informed everyone she would arrive in a few minutes, but no one knew she had already been in the building for 2 hours, preparing for the most important test in the company's history. Ricardo Vasconcelos occupied the chair to the right of the head seat, a position he had earned only 3 weeks earlier as the new strategic development manager. At 35, he was the youngest at the table, armed with an MBA from Columbia University, a flawless resume at multinationals, perfectly styled hair, a $3,000 suit, a French designer tie, and an arrogance sharp enough to slice through the air. Over the past few weeks, Ricardo had impressed everyone with brilliant presentations and bold proposals. His confidence bordered on arrogance, but results spoke for themselves. He had boosted his department's efficiency by 20% and was already talking openly about becoming VP before turning 40. What Ricardo didn't know was that Marina Santos had been watching his every move since day one. As the CEO of a company valued at $2 billion, she had learned that the true measure of an executive wasn't in the numbers they presented, but in how they treated those they considered beneath them. The meeting that was about to start would decide far more than million-dollar investments. It would decide whether Ricardo Vasconcelos had a future at Millennium Tech, or whether he was about to discover that some humiliations cost entire careers. The clock ticked to 9:05 and Marina Santos was about to enter that room, though not as the CEO everyone expected. The glass door slid open with a barely audible whisper, and a young woman with a simple appearance stepped in as if she were lost. Brown hair tied back in a plain ponytail, no salon treatment, a white cotton blouse worth no more than $15, faded jeans and unbranded flats. It was Marina Santos, though no one could have imagined that this 28-year-old woman with a soft Midwestern accent and timid demeanor ran a tech empire that generated billions each year. Marina carried a brown plastic folder, the kind bought at a corner stationery shop, and seemed genuinely intimidated by the luxury around her. Her eyes scanned the room with the naive admiration of someone who had never set foot in such a refined place. And when she greeted those present, her voice carried that country twang that irritated city-born New Yorkers. For years, Marina had perfected this persona, studying every detail to appear as the exact opposite of who she truly was. One of the brightest executives in the Americas, with a PhD in business administration from Harvard and fluency in 6 languages. "Excuse me, folks," Marina said, using a diminutive that made the executives cringe. "I'm Marina from the research department. Sorry I'm late. I got lost in the hallways. This building is a lot bigger than I expected." Her voice sounded genuinely awestruck, like a tourist visiting a palace for the first time. She made her way to a chair at the far end of the table, the seat farthest from the head, exactly where a low-level employee would sit at a board meeting. Ricardo Vasconcelos looked up from his papers and studied Marina with the calculating gaze he reserved for people he deemed irrelevant. For 3 seconds, he examined every detail of her plain clothes, untreated hair, and humble posture. His expression shifted into something between amusement and annoyance. As a seasoned manager, he had developed an unerring radar for identifying who truly belonged in this world of power and who was merely pretending. "Excuse me, miss," Ricardo said with the condescending tone he used for interns and low-level staff. "I think there's been a mistake. This is an executive board meeting. Maybe you're looking for the training room downstairs?" The smile that followed didn't reach his eyes, and there was a cruel edge in the way he said "miss," as if he were speaking to a lost child. Marina faked confusion, nervously fiddling with the strap of her plastic folder. "Oh, but I got an email from the secretary asking me to come. They said someone from my department was needed to provide some technical information." She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the kind poorly printed on a home printer, and handed it toward Ricardo as if it were an official credential. The other executives began exchanging uneasy glances. Dr. Fernando Almeida cleared his throat softly and checked his digital agenda, while Dr. Carla Montenegro frowned, trying to remember if she had requested technical support. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, like a symphony interrupted by an off note. Some executives looked genuinely confused, others started showing signs of impatience, and Ricardo saw in this situation a perfect chance to demonstrate his leadership and ability to solve problems. "Look, Marina, right?" Ricardo leaned back in his chair, assuming a paternalistic posture that left no doubt about who was in charge. "I'm sure you're very good at your job, whatever it is down there, but this meeting is about $50 million investments. Topics just a bit above your level of clearance. You understand?" The word clearance was pronounced with an exaggerated American accent, as if Marina couldn't possibly understand technical terms. Marina lowered her eyes and answered in a small voice. "I know I don't look like much, but I know a lot about the company's projects. Maybe I could help with some specific information." Her humility seemed genuine, almost touching, but there was something in her eyes that gleamed like a hidden blade in the grass. Ricardo let out a laugh that echoed through the room like shattering glass, a sound filled with the disdain accumulated over years of corporate climbing. It was the kind of laugh powerful men use to make clear that someone doesn't belong in their world, a social weapon sharp as a razor. "Competent," he repeated the word as if it were an inside joke. "Sweetheart, You look like you've never even seen a financial report. I bet when you hear cash flow, you think of a dripping faucet." The room fell into an awkward silence that lasted exactly 5 seconds, long enough for each executive to process what they had just heard. "Doctor." Fernando Almeida coughed lightly and shuffled papers unnecessarily, while Dr. Carla Montenegro looked up at the ceiling as if searching for an emergency exit. It was the kind of situation everyone preferred to ignore, but Ricardo was turning it into a public spectacle of gratuitous cruelty. Marina bit her lower lip and her cheeks flushed, a reaction that could be mistaken for shame or embarrassment. In truth, she was making a superhuman effort not to smile, because every word out of Ricardo's mouth was being recorded by the photographic memory that had taken her to the top of the corporate world before 30. I just wanted to help," she murmured, managing to make her voice tremble just enough. "Help?" Ricardo rose from his chair like a predator that had found easy prey. He walked over to where Marina sat, placed his hands on the table, and leaned over, deliberately invading her personal space. "You want to help? Then tell me this, country girl. Do you know the difference between EBITDA and ROI? Or are those just pretty letters grown-ups use when they play business?" The question was delivered in the tone of a sadistic teacher quizzing a student he knew would fail. Marina looked up with eyes that seemed on the verge of tears, a performance so convincing she nearly fooled herself. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization," she said hesitantly, as if unsure of the answer. "And ROI is return on investment, but I might be wrong." The correct response caught Ricardo off guard for half a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "Congratulations, you memorized Wikipedia," he sneered, dripping sarcasm. "Now, explain how to calculate the net present value of a $20 million investment with a 12% annual discount rate over 5 annual installments." It was a technical question that would make any financial analyst break into a sweat, crafted specifically to humiliate. Marina pretended to panic, nervously shuffling the papers in her plastic folder. In reality, she could solve that equation in her head in under 30 seconds, but instead, she whispered, I don't know how to do math that complicated. Sorry, I guess I really shouldn't be here." Her act was so convincing that some executives began to feel genuine pity. "Exactly." Ricardo clapped his hands once, as if he had just proven an important point. "You shouldn't be here. This room is for people who move billions, not for, how can I say this without offending, people from your social level." The pause before those final words was calculated for maximum sting, cruelty distilled into false courtesy. The atmosphere grew so tense that the hum of the air conditioner roared in everyone's ears. Dr. Carla Montenegro shifted uncomfortably in her chair and murmured, "Ricardo, maybe," but he cut her off with an imperious wave of his hand. Roberto Silva, the HR director, started taking mental notes that were certainly not favorable to the new manager, while other executives exchanged looks ranging from shock to morbid curiosity about how far this would go. Marina rose from her chair as if to leave, but Ricardo wasn't done with his power show. "Hold on, young lady," he said, using a diminutive that sounded particularly cruel coming from a 6-foot man. "Since you came here to interrupt our meeting, how about we do something fun, a little wager between friends?" His voice carried the malice of someone about to crush an insect for sport, without realizing that this insect had a sting strong enough to kill him. The word bet made every executive look up from their documents simultaneously, as if pulled by an invisible magnetic field. Ricardo smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just found the perfect entertainment for a dull morning, striding back to his chair with the confidence of a gladiator entering the arena against an unarmed opponent. Marina stopped mid-step, slowly turning with an expression that mixed curiosity and apprehension, like a gazelle that had just heard a suspicious sound in the savannah. "What kind of bet?" she asked, her voice small, as if she didn't want to sound interested, but couldn't resist the curiosity. It was exactly the reaction Ricardo had expected, that mix of fear and fascination that simple people show when someone powerful gives them a chance to play at the big table, even knowing they'll probably lose. Ricardo settled into his Italian leather chair and crossed his legs, assuming the relaxed posture of someone in total control of the situation. "It's simple, sweetheart. You said you know the company's projects, right? Then let's test that knowledge." He paused theatrically, savoring the moment like a chef about to serve his most elaborate dish. "I'll bet $100,000 you can't explain our international expansion strategy coherently. Not the basics any intern memorizes, but the real strategy, with numbers, timelines, challenges, and opportunities." The wager landed in the room like a silent bomb. $100,000 was more than the annual salary of 90% of American workers, a sum that could buy a luxury car or serve as a down payment on a house. For the executives present, it was significant but not devastating. For someone like Marina, who appeared to be a simple low-level employee, it was a fortune that could change her life or ruin it completely. Dr. Fernando Almeida cleared his throat nervously and muttered, "Ricardo, maybe that's a little—" But he was silenced by the manager's cutting glare. Dr. Carla Montenegro fiddled with her phone, probably calculating the legal implications of a bet made in a corporate setting, while Roberto Silva scribbled notes that were certainly not in Ricardo's favor in the behavioral evaluation report he was already drafting mentally. $100,000! Marina repeated the sum with a trembling voice, as if she had never heard so much money mentioned so casually. But I don't have that kind of money. If I lose—" She let the sentence trail off, painting exactly the picture of vulnerability Ricardo wanted to see. A simple woman being forced into an impossible situation by pure corporate sadism. "Relax, country girl," Ricardo replied with condescension dripping like poisoned honey. "When you lose, and you will lose, you won't have to pay me anything. You'll just admit in front of everyone here that you're nothing more than a third-rate employee who doesn't understand business, and that you'll never show up at an executive meeting again." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with calculated cruelty. "But if by some divine miracle you manage to explain our strategy better than me, then I'll pay you the $100,000 and resign on the spot." The offer was so disproportionate, it bordered on absurd. Ricardo was betting his career against the public humiliation of an employee he deemed insignificant, a calculation so arrogant that even executives used to inflated egos were taken aback by his audacity. Marina looked around the room, noting faces caught between embarrassment and morbid curiosity, like spectators at a car crash unable to look away. Marina began, then stopped, biting her lip as if making the hardest decision of her life. How much time would I have to prepare? The question came out as a near whisper, as if she were seriously considering a challenge that any sensible person would have refused immediately. Ricardo checked his Swiss watch, which cost more than a compact car, and smiled like a shark catching the scent of blood in the water. You have exactly 30 minutes to access any company system, review any document you want, and then present me with a full analysis of our international strategy. He rapped his knuckles on the table, setting the rhythm like a maestro conducting a symphony of humiliation. 30 minutes to prove you're not just another country bumpkin lost in the big city. Do you accept the bet, or are you going to leave with your tail between your legs? The silence that followed was so thick it felt solid, an invisible wall of tension separating the before and after. Marina drew a deep breath, looked once more at the faces around the table, and then spoke the words that sealed Ricardo Vasconcelos's fate. I accept. Marina's acceptance fell over the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of surprise across the executives' faces. Ricardo blinked twice, clearly not expecting his victim to accept such an obviously impossible challenge. There was something about the calmness with which she spoke those two words that made a small alarm bell flash in the back of his mind. But his arrogance was far too great to let genuine doubt take shape. Perfect. Ricardo clapped his hands with exaggerated enthusiasm, like a circus ringmaster announcing the most dangerous act of the night. Then it's settled. 30 minutes on the clock, and you can use any company resource. He gestured grandly toward the room's computers. Access whatever you want, call whomever you want, review whatever documents you like. Just don't cry when you realize the corporate world isn't child's play. Marina nodded and walked to one of the nearest computer workstations, a state-of-the-art machine worth more than a mid-sized car with enough processing power to run complex market simulations. As she sat down, Ricardo checked the time and announced theatrically, 9:42. The clock starts. Now. What happened in the next 5 minutes made several executives sit up straighter with intrigued expressions. Marina typed a sequence of characters on the keyboard with the fluency of someone who had done it thousands of times, and the screen immediately displayed an interface most of those present had never seen before. It was the company's internal business intelligence system, a platform restricted to the highest levels of the hierarchy, protected by multiple layers of authentication and passwords. How did she get access to that? Dr. Fernando Almeida whispered to Dr. Carla Montenegro, who frowned as she watched Marina navigate the menus with suspicious familiarity. The system required not just a login and password, but also biometric authentication and rotating access codes updated weekly. It was physically impossible for a low-level employee to have those credentials unless... Marina opened 6 dashboards simultaneously, each displaying financial data that made the executive's eyes dance with figures in the billions. Quarterly performance reports, international market analyses, 5-year growth projections, confidential contracts with Asian suppliers, and budget spreadsheets containing information so sensitive that even some of those present didn't have clearance to view them. Ricardo stopped smiling when Marina opened a file titled Confidential Strategy, Latin America 2024 to 2029, a document he himself had helped draft, but that theoretically could only be accessed by 5 people in the entire company. Wait a second, he said, jumping to his feet abruptly. How do you have access to those files? That's classified material. Oh, sorry. Marina replied without taking her eyes off the screen, typing rapidly as she absorbed data flashing before her. The HR lady gave me some temporary passwords so I could do my job. She said it was normal for outside consultants. The explanation sounded plausible, but there was something about her posture, about the way her fingers danced across the keyboard, that didn't match the image of an unprepared employee she had projected for the last 15 minutes. Dr. Carla Montenegro leaned forward, peering at the screen over Marina's shoulder, and her face paled when she saw figures only the executive board should know. These numbers, some of them weren't even presented at the last quarterly meeting, she whispered to Roberto Silva, who was already discreetly taking notes in his personal notebook. Marina kept working with mechanical efficiency, opening spreadsheets, cross-referencing data, doing mental math that would have taken a senior analyst hours to complete. In 15 minutes, she had compiled information that normally took a full team days to process, organizing everything into an improvised presentation that began taking shape on the screen with colorful charts and complex mathematical projections. Ricardo watched with growing confusion and irritation. This wasn't the performance of an incompetent employee desperately trying to impress the bosses. This was the work of someone who knew those systems better than he did, someone navigating the company's confidential data as if it were an extension of her own memory. A strange chill began forming in Ricardo's stomach, the primal feeling mammals get when they realize they may have picked the wrong prey to attack. At 9:57, Marina rose from the workstation, adjusted her simple cotton blouse, and turned to the room with a shy smile that didn't reach her eyes. 15 minutes had passed since the bet began, and in that time she had compiled a presentation that would make senior analysts sweat with envy. The screen behind her displayed 3D graphs, growth projections across 16 countries, and a market analysis so detailed it looked like it had taken months to prepare. "Well," Marina began, and for the first time, her voice sounded slightly different, as if a layer of performance had been peeled away. "You want me to explain our international expansion strategy, right? I'll start with the basics and then move on to the more interesting details." The word interesting carried a subtle inflection that made Dr. Fernando Almeida frown, because there was something familiar in that tone, something he had heard before, though he couldn't quite place where. Marina pointed to the first graph on the screen, a visual representation of the company's growth over the last 5 years, with numbers that would make any American CEO proud. Our revenue grew from $200 million to $2.3 billion between 2019 and 2024, a growth of 1,150%. That placed us among the 5 largest tech companies in the country, but it also created an interesting problem: market saturation at home. Ricardo stood watching, increasingly uneasy at every word Marina spoke. The numbers were accurate, but no low-level employee should have known them. Even more disturbing was the way she presented them, with the natural confidence of someone who had personally overseen each step of that growth, not as someone parroting lines from a report. "The market analysis we commissioned from McKinsey last March," Marina continued, clicking to the next slide, "identified 3 priority markets for expansion: Mexico, Argentina, and Chile. The initial investment would be $50 million, distributed as $20 million for infrastructure, $15 million for local talent acquisition, $10 million for marketing, and $5 million reserved for contingencies." Dr. Carla Montenegro let out a faint gasp that sounded almost like a moan. That specific information about McKinsey had been shared only with the executive board, and the full report was locked in digital vaults requiring multiple authorizations for access. How could a so-called temporary consultant not only know the numbers, but also the exact methodology and budget distribution? Marina advanced to the third slide, which displayed a detailed timeline with specific milestones and dates that made the executives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Phase 1 would begin in January 2025 with the opening of the Mexico City office, followed by the hiring of 50 local employees specialized in software development. February would be dedicated to partnerships with 3 Mexican universities for an internship program, and March would mark the official launch of our platform tailored for the Hispanic market. What genuinely alarmed everyone was when Marina began mentioning details that went beyond the official reports. What doesn't show up in the formal documentation is that we identified a unique opportunity in the Mexican banking sector. Banco Santander Mexico has been looking for a provider of digital security solutions for 8 months, and they've set aside a budget of 300 million pesos for the next 3 years. If we land that contract, it alone would pay for our expansion and still generate a 40% profit in the first year. Ricardo felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. That information about Banco Santander Mexico had been shared with him under ultra-confidential terms during a meeting with exactly 3 people: himself, CEO Marina Santos, and the CFO. It was impossible, absolutely impossible, for some random employee to have access to commercial intelligence at that level. "How do you know about Santander?" Ricardo asked, his voice higher than usual, betraying the nerves that were beginning to erode his confidence. "That information isn't in any report. I was in the meeting where that was discussed, and the only people there were—" Marina cut him off with a smile that carried something dangerous, like a blade wrapped in silk. "Oh, you were in that meeting. How interesting." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like toxic smoke. "And do you remember who else was there? Because I have an excellent memory for faces and important conversations." The silence that followed was unlike any before. It was no longer the silence of embarrassment or morbid curiosity. It was the silence of gradual recognition, the suspended moment when reality begins to reorganize itself and all the seemingly disconnected pieces start forming an image that should have been obvious from the start. Dr. Fernando Almeida dropped the pen in his hand and stared at Marina wide-eyed, while Dr. Carla Montenegro covered her mouth with her hand in a growing expression of shock. Ricardo stayed frozen, like an animal hypnotized by oncoming headlights, finally beginning to understand he had made a mistake that would cost far more than $100,000. Marina walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated the New York skyline, and for the first time since entering the room, her posture changed completely. Her shoulders squared, her head lifted, and when she turned back to face the room, the disguise had vanished like smoke on the wind. The timid country girl had evaporated, and in her place stood someone who radiated natural authority, as if this seat of power had been built specifically for her. "You want to know how I have access to confidential information?" Marina asked, and her voice now carried a commanding tone that made everyone in the room straighten in their chairs, almost involuntarily. "It's because I personally attended every meeting where these decisions were made. I authorized every investment, approved every strategy, and signed every contract you just saw on the screen." She paused for exactly 5 seconds, long enough for the weight of her words to sink into each person's consciousness. Ricardo opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. His brain was struggling to process information that simply didn't fit the reality he had constructed over the last 40 minutes. The simple woman from the countryside he had publicly humiliated was speaking like someone with the authority to make $50 million decisions, and the way she referenced confidential meetings wasn't that of someone who had read reports. It was that of someone who had presided over those meetings. "Impossible," murmured Dr. Fernando Almeida, though his voice sounded more like a desperate plea to the universe than a statement of fact. "You can't be... Marina Santos has..." He trailed off mid-sentence, staring at the woman before him with mounting horror, because for the first time he was truly seeing her face, not the performance she'd been putting on. Marina smiled, and it was a smile that carried 5 years of corporate leadership, 10 years of education at elite universities, and a lifetime of learning to navigate different social worlds. Has what, Dr. Almeida? A different look? A different accent? A different background? Each question was a precise thrust aimed not only at the CFO, but at every unspoken prejudice in that room. Dr. Carla Montenegro was the first to connect all the dots, and when understanding hit her, she turned paper white. "My God," she whispered, bringing her hands to her face. "You're Marina Santos. Our Marina Santos, the CEO." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of absolute shock, as if she had just realized she'd spent the last hour speaking with a ghost. "Exactly," Marina confirmed, and now her voice carried the full authority of someone who led 2,000 employees and made decisions that affected the national economy. "I am Marina Santos, founder and CEO of Millennium Tech, born in Peoria, Illinois, daughter of a mechanic and an elementary school teacher. Degree in engineering on a full scholarship, PhD in business administration from Harvard, and yes, I still slip into a country twang when I'm nervous or when I want people to underestimate me." The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out by an invisible industrial vacuum. Roberto Silva, the HR director, stared at Marina as if seeing a mirage in the desert, while the other executives began shifting uncomfortably, replaying every word they'd said, every glance they'd exchanged, every laugh they'd shared at the expense of the woman now revealed as the most powerful person in their professional lives. Ricardo finally managed to form words, but they came out as a strangled noise. But why? Why do this? Why pretend to be... He couldn't finish the sentence because any word he chose to describe how he had viewed Marina over the last 40 minutes would be a confession of his own prejudices. "Pretend to be what, Ricardo?" Marina asked, taking a step toward him. "Poor, country, someone who doesn't belong in this world?" Each word was a sharp blade, slicing through the arrogance that had defined Ricardo's persona since the day he joined the company. "Because I wanted to see how you treat people you consider beneath you. I wanted to understand what kind of organizational culture we really have here, beyond what shows up in HR reports." Marina approached the conference table, placed her hands on the polished mahogany surface, and leaned forward slightly, assuming the commanding posture she used in the most important meetings. "Over the last 6 months, I ran this test with 12 executives across different departments. I posed as a janitor, an intern, a temp consultant, always observing how you treat those you think are below you on the social ladder." Her voice grew stronger with each word, like a storm rolling in on the horizon. "And do you know what I discovered, Ricardo?" Marina looked straight into his eyes, and it was the gaze of a CEO about to make a decision that would change lives. "I discovered that some of our executives are exactly the kind of people I don't want representing this company. People who think social origin determines competence. People who use power to humiliate instead of to build." What happened in the next 5 seconds would change Ricardo Vasconcellos' fate forever. Ricardo collapsed into the Italian leather chair like a rag doll with its strings cut, his face cycling through every shade of red before settling into a cadaverous white that made his freckles look like ink stains on paper. For 3 weeks, he had bragged about working directly with Marina Santos, telling friends and family how he'd impressed the youngest CEO in the American tech sector. Now he realized he had spent 40 minutes publicly humiliating the same woman who signed his paycheck and had the power to end his career with a single word. "My God," he muttered, his voice leaking out like air from a punctured tire. I didn't know. How could I have known? It was the kind of desperate excuse people make when they realize there's no escape from the situation they've created. A pathetic attempt to rewrite the last 40 minutes as if they were just some cosmic misunderstanding. Marina showed no compassion for the plea embedded in his words. Instead, she walked slowly around the table, stopping behind each chair and taking in the expressions of the executives who had witnessed the spectacle of cruelty Ricardo had staged. "Do you want to know something interesting about human behavior?" she asked the entire room. "When people think they have power over someone, they reveal who they really are beneath the professional facade." Dr. Fernando Almeida tried to pull himself together, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat nervously. "Marina, CEO Santos, we didn't know you were, if we'd known." But she cut him off with a subtle motion of her hand, the kind of gesture natural leaders use when they want immediate silence. "Exactly, Dr. Almeida. You didn't know. And that's precisely why this test is so revealing." Marina stopped behind Ricardo's chair, placing her hands on the backrest like a judge presiding over a courtroom. "If you had known who I was, you'd have treated me with respect, not because of my character or competence, but because of my title. That isn't real respect, it's just corporate hierarchy." Ricardo tried to turn to look at Marina, but she set a hand on his shoulder, keeping him facing the other executives. "No, Ricardo, you're going to stay right where you are and listen to what I have to say. For 40 minutes, you treated me like human garbage. You called me a hillbilly, questioned my ability to read spreadsheets, and made a $100,000 bet based on your absolute certainty that I was beneath you." Her voice was controlled, but it carried a chill that made everyone in the room shiver. Dr. Carla Montenegro shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to intervene in a situation that had become a public reckoning. Roberto Silva was taking notes frantically, probably already calculating the legal and HR implications of what he was witnessing. The other executives remained in absolute silence, like spectators at a train wreck who couldn't look away. "But the most revealing part," Marina continued, starting to pace slowly around the room, "was how you all reacted. Some of you looked uncomfortable, but no one defended me. No one said Ricardo's behavior was wrong. You just sat there, watching an employee be humiliated, and at most exchanged embarrassed glances with each other." Her words struck every person present like well-aimed bullets because it was an accusation they couldn't deny. Ricardo finally managed to turn in his chair, and when he looked at Marina, his eyes were red, as if he were on the verge of tears. "Please," he said, the word coming out as a desperate whisper. "I can explain. I can change. This isn't who I really am." It was the classic plea of someone who has just been caught being exactly who they are when they think no one important is watching. "It isn't who you are," Marina repeated, genuine incredulity in her tone. "Ricardo, in the last 40 minutes, I saw you in your purest form. I saw how you treat people you consider inferior. I saw the pleasure you take in exerting power over those who can't defend themselves. I saw you make a cruel bet just to amuse yourself at the expense of someone you thought was vulnerable." She stopped in front of him, forcing him to hold her gaze. "This isn't a moment of weakness, Ricardo. This is exactly who you are." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the barely audible hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 27 floors below. Ricardo stared at Marina with the look of someone who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and that the only person who could save him was the very one he had spent the morning trying to destroy. Marina straightened, taking on the formal posture she used for major announcements, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the final authority of someone about to change another person's fate forever. "Ricardo Vasconcelos, considering your behavior this morning, and bearing in mind that a company is defined by the values its leaders demonstrate when they believe no one is watching, I have a decision to announce." The air in the room grew so dense it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Ricardo remained still, like a defendant awaiting the final verdict of a jury whose decision had already been made. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to hold on to some shred of professional dignity, but it was like trying to hold water between his fingers. For 3 weeks, he had built a solid reputation at Millennium Tech, impressing colleagues with brilliant presentations and innovative strategies. Now, 40 minutes of arrogance and prejudice were about to dismantle everything he had achieved. Marina walked to the head of the table, physically assuming the position of leadership that had always been hers by right. When she turned to face the room, there was no trace left of the timid country woman who had entered an hour earlier. This was Marina Santos in her purest form, a CEO who had built a $2 billion empire through intelligence, determination, and an unflinching ability to make hard decisions when necessary. "Over the last 6 months," she began, addressing not only Ricardo, but the entire executive board, "I implemented a behavioral evaluation program that goes far beyond traditional performance reports, because I've learned that technical competence without character is a dangerous combination in leadership roles." Her voice echoed through the room with the clarity of someone who had spent a long time weighing every word she was about to say. Ricardo tried to interrupt with a "CEO Santos, please let me explain." But Marina raised her hand in a gesture that brooked no challenge. It was the kind of silent command only natural leaders can exert, authority that comes not from a title, but from a presence honed over years of making decisions that affect thousands of people. "You'll have your chance to speak, Ricardo, but I will finish first." Marina looked straight at him, and in her eyes was a professional coldness that made several executives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "What I witnessed this morning wasn't just social prejudice, it was abuse of power in its purest form. You used your position to humiliate someone you considered beneath you, not for professional reasons, but out of sheer social sadism." Dr. Fernando Almeida cleared his throat nervously and leaned forward, clearly trying to mediate before things reached an irreversible point. "Marina, perhaps we can handle this internally through behavioral training or—" But she cut him off, with a look that made clear the decision had already been made and was not up for negotiation. "Dr. Almeida, I appreciate the attempt at diplomacy, but some things aren't fixed by training. Either a person has fundamental values of respect and decency, or they don't. What I saw today wasn't an error in judgment, it was a revelation of character." Marina turned her attention back to Ricardo, who had gone so pale his freckles looked like ink dots on white paper. Ricardo finally found the courage to speak, and when he did, his voice came out strangled by despair. "CEO Santos, I made a terrible mistake. I accept that. But please, give me a chance to show I can change. I need this job." I have responsibilities, a family. It was the classic plea of someone who had finally understood that actions have consequences, even when they thought their power would keep them safe. Marina studied him for a long moment, and for an instant seemed to consider his words. Then she replied with the firmness of someone who had made far tougher decisions over the course of her career. Ricardo, you're right about one thing. You made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't a slip in judgment or a moment of weakness. It was a clear demonstration of who you really are when you think you can act without consequences. What she said next would echo in that room for years, becoming corporate legend about the importance of treating every human being with dignity, regardless of social background or rank. Ricardo Vasconcelos, Marina pronounced the full name with the solemnity of a judicial sentence. Your employment with Millennium Tech is terminated, effective immediately. You will receive only what is required under applicable federal and state law, no severance, and no letter of recommendation. The words fell over the room like hammer blows, each syllable sealing the professional fate of a man who had woken up that morning believing he was on top of the world. Ricardo collapsed completely, burying his face in his hands in a display of despair that was both genuine and pathetic. 3 weeks of work, years of career building, and decades of professional networking had been destroyed in 40 minutes of distilled arrogance. My career is over, he murmured between his fingers, his voice muffled and broken. No one will hire me after this. How am I going to explain this to my family? Marina watched his collapse without showing any compassion because she had learned over the years that some lessons can only be taught through real, irreversible consequences. Your career isn't over, Ricardo, but the career you imagined, built on stepping on others and using power to humiliate, that is over. Maybe now you'll learn to build a new one based on respect and genuine competence. She turned to the other executives, who watched everything in absolute silence, absorbing a lesson worth more than any leadership course they had ever taken. I hope all of you paid attention to what happened here today. This company was built on values of innovation, excellence, and inclusion. Anyone who uses their position to diminish others because of social origin, appearance, or any other reason will have no place at Millennium Tech. Dr. Fernando Almada nodded vigorously, clearly absorbing the message and probably rethinking some of his own behavior over the years. Dr. Carla Montenegro was making mental notes that would certainly become new HR policies, while Roberto Silva was already calculating the changes needed in the company-wide behavioral evaluation protocols. Marina walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching New York stretch to the horizon like an ocean of concrete and possibility. Over the next 6 months, we'll implement mandatory social awareness training for all management levels. We'll create an anonymous channel for reporting discriminatory behavior, and we'll establish diversity goals not only for race and gender, but also for socioeconomic background, because talent doesn't choose its birthplace. When she turned back to the room, her eyes held the relentless determination that had taken her from a small-town girl to CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country. Do you want to know why I built this company? It wasn't just to make money or conquer markets. It was to prove that competence and character matter more than your last name or your parents' bank account. It was to create a place where people like me, who weren't born with a silver spoon, could show what we're capable of. Ricardo rose slowly from the chair, his dignity destroyed, yet still trying to maintain some control over the situation. I'll go, he said, his voice hoarse with humiliation. But I want everyone to know this is unfair. One moment doesn't define an entire person. It was the last desperate attempt of someone who still hadn't fully understood the lesson being taught. Marina looked at him one last time, her voice a mix of firmness and something that might have been mistaken for pity. You're wrong, Ricardo. Moments like this define exactly who we are. When we think no one important is watching, when we think we can act without consequences, that's when our true nature shows. She paused for 5 seconds, long enough for her words to sink not only into Ricardo's mind, but into everyone else's as well. The door is there. Use it, and let this experience teach you to be a better person at your next job. If anyone is brave enough to give you a second chance. With those final words, Ricardo Vasconcelos walked toward the door, carrying not only his executive briefcase, but the weight of a lesson that would follow him for the rest of his life. The room remained in absolute silence until the sound of his footsteps disappeared completely down the hall. Then Marina turned to the remaining executives with a smile that held no joy, only the cool satisfaction of someone who had just delivered justice. Now, she said, returning to the professional tone she used to conduct business, let's discuss that $50 million international expansion investment. And this time, let's do it as a team that understands respect isn't a privilege, it's a basic human right. 6 months later, Millennium Tech would be recognized as one of the best companies to work for in the United States, not only for competitive salaries, but for an organizational culture that treated every employee with dignity, regardless of origin or rank. The story of Ricardo Vasconcelos became corporate legend, told in boardrooms and training programs as an example of what happens when power is used to tear down instead of build. And Marina Santos remained the CEO who proved that competence and character always outmatch prejudice and arrogance, building not only a successful company, but a legacy that true talent knows no social boundaries.